I'm sorry to say this will be my last video covering Professional StarCraft 2. In relation to the 5.0.14 patch, which has finally come to the live server after multiple iterations on the public test realm. So, once again, we're going to be covering the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I'd say about equal parts of each one. But before we get started, it'd be awesome if you can do what you never do to the ranked button in game, which is smash that like button, and maybe even subscribe. And now, greetings from the StarCraft 2 Community Balance Council. After several weeks of testing, we're prepared to release the final set of changes, including only a couple of small adjustments from the latest package. We're thankful for the community, who've been highly active in organizing tournaments, playing, and providing feedback on the new changes. And we hope the new patch will improve the game and make it even more enjoyable for both players and viewers. So, we're going to go over the very new changes, the general whole package of changes, and then some other thoughts. And we're going to try to keep it more coherent than the Balance Council themselves did with this admitted meandering path towards the patch we have today. But anyways, early game in Protoss versus Terran. So, shield battery overcharge removed, energy recharge added, and the Community Council comments. We believe that the energy recharge ability has found its place in various Protoss builds and various scenarios. With a couple small adjustments below, we feel that the current set of Protoss and Terran changes is an overall improvement for Protoss gameplay stability in the early game compared to the previous patch. So what are those changes? The shield battery, remember, has been... Shield battery overcharge is removed, but the shield battery has a little more HP and shields. So the range for the shield battery starting with full energy increased from 10 to 12 from the closest nexus, and energy recharge from 10 to 12 as well. So these are the additions. The increased range will allow players to be more flexible, placing batteries while defending their bases and expanding, without boosting the offensive capabilities of shield batteries. If you remember Haz versus Serral, many years ago, probably the best demonstration of the offensive uses of shield batteries on top of the Void Ray patches of like 2020, 2021. So, I disagree. I do not think this will do much to help early game Protoss versus Terran. Not having shield battery overcharge, having 100 more energy on an Oracle or a Sentry, you're not going to have a high Templar by the time any early game, especially Protoss versus Terran attacks come in. Having a little more range on the shield battery or energy recharge is laughable as an addition to make it more defensible. Yes, it will help a little, but MaxPax has already commented, many Protoss have already commented, that without shield battery overcharge, you're already more vulnerable at the most vulnerable points of the game. Which is, before you get... So, it's becoming more and more blink or die trying. Because blink stalkers are the only way to keep the Terrans at bay. Otherwise, you get run over before you can put together the army you need in order to actually fight. We're talking about 2-base tank pushes. We're talking about all the early game shenanigans with the new and old Cyclones. Anything along those lines. So, I think the energy recharge ability is actually super interesting. And it works quite well in Protoss versus Zerg. Though, Protoss still vulnerable in the early game against Zerg. Zerg doesn't have units that can circumvent your defenses nearly as easily as Terran. So, even without shield battery overcharge, having 100 energy on your Oracle may help you defend against a Zerg push. Whereas having 100 energy on your Oracle will not help it not die to Cyclone in 3 seconds, or Widowmine in 1. So, the energy recharge ability, replacing shield battery overcharge, I think does very little to help an early game Protoss versus Terran. I want to circle back here, just like we've done on some changes, and say, I'm coming from my bias, which is not winning more ladder games where I'm already suffering against Protoss, all right? Playing against Protoss is a struggle on the ladder, because Protoss units are very good and I am not. But my biscuit is not buttered by my ladder points, but instead by people watching YouTube videos, liking, and subscribing. And I don't think those people who are mostly watching the game can be ignored when they say putting a Protoss in the game already feels like a spoiler, because you know if it's not max packs what the outcome's going to be. And while Protoss is heavily overrepresented in like the mid-tiers of weekly tournaments, and to an extent overrepresented in Grandmaster, that doesn't translate to the games that 90% of people are watching. All right, you have Hero, who is, well, we either hope he's drunk or sober on that day. I'm not sure which one's better. We have MaxPax, who unfortunately is dark on another computer, so can't play in LAN tournaments or whatever conspiracy theory you'd like. And then, what? Now this comes back to the age-old argument. Are Protoss players just worse, or are they worse because they chose Protoss? But we're getting a little bit off track here. Let's circle back and maybe get caught in the gravity well of our new re-embiggened units. The Mothership is large again. The Mothership has been reverted in cost and size to kind of its original size. Same with the Ultralisk, which is actually a nerf as well. Because now the Ultra will struggle more, even though the Ultra got a buff to shoving its friends out of the way, which will allow it to close the distance faster. The Ultra speed got nerfed, and now by being larger, it's harder to get more Ultras into a certain area and actually attack. So, let's comment on these, on whether size matters. We'd like to continue following community feedback on the identity of these powerful units. The Mothership is back to its original power level, and increasing its size fits this change perfectly. The adjustment may also slightly help in focus firing the unit where Abduct is no longer a counter. The Ultralisk, the original idea of reducing its size was to minimize cases where it got stuck behind other allied units, an issue now resolved. The Ultralisk change, fine. In fact, I think the new Ultras serve their purpose. We've seen them be quite successful, especially combined with the Ghost nerf in Zerg versus Terran. They still are kind of terrible against Protoss because Immortals and Carriers exist. Now, when it comes to this change, I'm sorry, were we struggling to pick out the Mothership in a crowd? So this is actually, in my opinion, a nerf to Zerg, because you know what the big issue with Motherships is? Not clicking on the biggest unit in the game, your Mothership, but the Templar underneath. So when it comes to Zerg versus Protoss, Zergs who aren't from Finland, well, one Zerg from Finland, struggle. Dark, somewhat an exception. Everyone else, we saw it in Shin versus MaxPax in the very first series on the new patch. But with the Mothership not being abductable and energy recharge, since Zerg doesn't have EMP. Zerg Cabal, get on that. But since Zerg doesn't have EMP, you can warp in a Templar and immediately drop 2 storms on it. So between having multiple storms, as well as a much stronger Mothership, Zerg versus Protoss late game just got that much harder, and it already was not easy for the Zerg past a certain point. And I will also admit and point out that without shield battery overcharge, Protoss still has those fragile vulnerabilities in the early game, especially if you lose your Oracle, one of the most fragile units in the game. Or you just don't have the position when like a Ravager Lingalling comes in. So the theme of this patch overall, and I'm kind of working off my comments on the other balanced patch videos, is not necessarily changing any of the issues, but instead exacerbating them. Like the energy recharge is a very cool idea for giving Protoss better scouting than an adept sniffing its ethereal nose on a depot and hoping they can figure out whether it's going to be Cyclones, Widow Mines, or 38 Marauders. So yes, being able to drop energy on a sentry and send a hallucinated Phoenix across is great for scouting that you're about to die to a 2-base tank push because you don't have shield battery overcharge. We will see. No, we won't see. We already know. Players have already said. We'll see. The Thor explosive weapon. So the Thor got a buff to murdering mutas, and received feedback from both Terran and players from other races who don't matter as much that they did not feel positively about this change. It didn't unlock any new playstyles while negatively impacting existing ones. So while we still see potential in adjusting the Thor, it'll remain unchanged. So the Thor was changed to have less damage drop off, but less range. So essentially it would murder things like mutas, or in whatever scenario this is that I've never seen in a real game, Void Rays, even harder. So, for some reason, we spent any time trying to figure out how to make one of the Thor's 3 attacks. It has 3 attacks. It has its ground attack, where it does a terrible, terrible damage on single target. It has high impact mode, which counters most long-range air units, like Broodlords or Tempest. And then it has the explosive damage mode, which was pretty much only used for mutas. Because the other... So the thing is, the Thor is suffering from success. High impact mode, which wasn't even originally in the game, it was added to the Thor to give them more anti-air capability, is so good that explosive payload is only used in very niche scenarios. Because the high impact mode against everything but like stacked up Phoenixes and mutas is just not as good as having guaranteed long range damage. So this was an addition to the Thor to make it have even more utility, which, cool idea. Why is it always the Terran units that get that? That's my feeling. Alright, am I biased against Terran? Well, I don't know. I've been testing it out. I like to put my non-existent prize money where my mouth is. And so far, on the new patch... Now, this is not all on the new patch, to be fair. But I've made sure to test everything out. And I like to play a lot of different other styles. Like, I'm a big fan of mech, which works perfectly fine at the mediocre level of play. I'm only in the top 1% of players, not the top 0.1% that... Actually, the top 8 players, aka the top 0.0001% or whatever it is. So, but does Terran need more options for their units? Does the Thor need to have 3 great abilities instead of just 2? Well, this is replicated in the Orbital Command Supply Drop ability. This reads like somebody's campaign wish list that accidentally made it to the Balance Council. I'm not saying that this ability is overpowered. In fact, I think this is a nerf to Terran, because now the Orbital Command has 3 great abilities. It's going to be so hard to choose which amazing, incredible ability you want to spam. And now here's the weird thing to this. It doesn't even... I guess the idea... So, we're pretending the point of the patch was to nerf defensive and camping playstyles. And then we turn around and buff... like a literally defending camping ability, which feels a bit odd. Thankfully, we removed things like salvaging missile turrets, but I have no idea. That one sticks out as it made it through. It made it through to the game. It's in the game now. I doubt you'll ever see it in anything but very niche scenarios. Maybe occasionally defending against Blink or Ravager all-ins, but it feels like it's completely out of left field. I'm not necessarily disagree with it, but where did that come from? Whose idea even was? Terrans could already... If any race needed the ability to have use their... Okay, so what we did, we took away Shield Battery Overcharge for Protoss. 50 energy on your main base to give you defensive capability. And we gave them energy recharge, which is 50 energy to give you energy, which doesn't necessarily translate to defensive capability. And then we gave Terrans, who could already repair their depots, more defensive capability. Moving on. The Ghost Nerf. Community Council comment. We've heard major concerns from multiple professional Terran players about the Ghost Nerf, and there wasn't a full alignment among the Balance Council members regarding the change. We also believe that proceeding with this change was desired by the community, so we'd like to move forward with the Ghost Supply Nerf while carefully monitoring its effects. You could sound a little less passive-aggressive, I guess, but it's like, well, Terran players fought tooth and nail, but then Clem forced our hand by saying the Ghost might be a little strong. It wasn't until Clem publicly posted that, yeah, maybe the Ghost is a bit much, that it seems we made any progress on this. And I did say, if I could have nothing else for the Ghost, it would be 3 supply, which is a pretty ham-fisted way to nerf it. and is definitely more of a nerf in Terran versus Zerg than it is in Terran versus Protoss, because in Terran versus Zerg, those 30 ghosts are going to become, okay, 25 ghosts are going to become 15, or another drop less of supply. But it doesn't take that many ghosts to EMP the entire Protoss army. I'd also love to see testing around EMP projectile speed. The fact that most people don't even know it's a projectile, I think, is part of the issue. Damage over time. Guardian Shield in some way reducing its effect. Like, in some way to mitigate a near hit scan projectile that wipes out half the effective HP of your army instantaneously. But, now consider this. Ghosts are hard to use. Alright? Now, just ignoring any success that Terra might have had in the last, I don't know, World Cup, ghosts are really, like, they're hard to use. So, there's that. This reads... Well, I guess I'm surprised we got the ghost nerf at all, but it's like, well, here, take your nerf and be happy. Well, I guess I'm happy then. Zerg versus Protoss. The Mothership no longer being abductible and the overall late-game Protoss army being stronger after the Tempest change. We're all concerned about the potential state of Zerg versus Protoss late game across different levels of play. We received suggestions for some experimental changes, but they'd require extensive testing, which would significantly delay the release of the patch. I will say, it's a bit disheartening to hear that after hearing nothing for 3 weeks after the first update. When was the PTR update? October 31st. It is November 27th this patch has gone live. Or 26th. Feels like maybe there was some time in there. But for those who don't know, and you're watching this maybe in a few days, Home Story Cup, which is the first major tournament on this patch, Cyril will be playing, is happening just a few days afterwards. So that is the deadline, I think, that was there. And getting the intern. So this comes back to a more serious issue. I don't think the Balance Council, for the most part, is intentionally making incoherent changes. I think the design by committee style combined with the aggressive neglect that Blizzard has shown to the game is creating a near perfect storm of a near perfect clusterfuck of less than ideal scenarios. We don't have, it seems, anyone really say, we don't have a balanced dictator saying, no, that's stupid, like, why are we talking about an orbital command supply drop? That isn't even in the realm of things we need to be talking about right now. Thor's getting another one. What is that? Why are we talking? What? The Ghost. Late game Zerg versus Protoss. Late game, early game Protoss versus Terran. All right, these are what we are concerned about. Focus. Focus. But it feels like that focus is not there. Instead, half the time it's just like, in the original version of the patch, which, after significant backlash, we actually removed, where Hellion Blue Flame buff. Missile turrets can be salvaged. The Tempest actually got not as much of a buff as it was going to. And let's see. Oh yeah, the Broodlord bug was fixed. And then unfixed, which is another thing we'll get to, but there's no one in charge. I propose, so if there was someone I would trust, not me, I would never want to do this, I just want to complain, I'd say it's Pig. Now, it's a thankless job with, in fact, the opposite of thanks from pretty much everyone. But even though I don't agree with Pig on a lot of his theories and ideas about the game, I agree with more than I disagree. And also, he's both an experienced pro player formerly and a current content creator. So his bias is getting more people to watch the game, just like mine. And without wanting one race to be favored over another, because that gets less people to watch because there's less variety. So, when people feel like a certain matchup at any level going in is heavily favored or just not entertaining, they will not be watching for long. And if pro players, either consciously or unconsciously, are making changes that favor their playstyles or their race, well, the amount of pro players that'll be benefiting from them will drastically decrease as time goes on. So, because simply less people will be interested in watching. So that leaves us in a very weird spot with that. Like, for some reason, the new map pool we have 6 new maps, of which I'm not a massive fan of all of them, but they're interesting. And for some reason, the other 3 maps are from 2018 and 2019. I don't care what the opinion is on King's Cove or Neon Violet Square or Abyssal Reef. There was no announcement and still has not been. It feels like amateur hour. I don't understand what's happening. I have not seen any sort of reasoning as to why we have 3 maps from half a decade ago randomly showing up in the map pool. There was no announcement, no explanation. There are 100 maps right now that map makers that would be perfectly great to put on the ladder, and if they have any issues, map makers would be more than happy to either fix, adjust, or test them. Today, yesterday, for the last many months, to the intern's credit, all the team game maps have shifted. Now, somewhat confusingly, there are 9 maps in 2v2. There are 9 maps. Wait, there were less maps yesterday. I don't know what's happening, actually. This keeps changing out of date. We'll keep you updated. And by that, I mean we're not going to say anything. We'll carefully monitor the situation. Moving on. So, the summary is, Terran, the Ghost nerf, the Terrans hated it, but that's why we nerfed a little bit of almost everything that Ghosts are usually good against. Zerg versus Protoss in the late game, sucks to be you. Now, Zerg is probably going to have more success and more commonly do early all-ins against Protoss. But especially on the ladder, playing against Skytoss and Carriers and Templar will be even more impossible. And by impossible, I mean, yes, very technically, you could deal with it, but it is an infuriating play style to play against. I say from both sides of the story. And I severely dislike it. And if it becomes a more default play style in pro games, well, very simply, nobody's going to watch Zerg versus... Nobody's going to want to watch Zerg versus Protoss. You can only clickbait the mothership so much before it gets boring. Anyways, full changelog. Now we're just going to run through the changes here. And try to talk about some more of the implications. Alright, Protoss Nexus. Maximum range for shield battery, starting with full energy increased. Battery overcharge removed. Energy recharge added. Shield battery now has more HP. Now that doesn't matter that you're targeting it. Train time from the gateway. The gateway, not warp gate, just the gateway. This still does not make it quicker than warping in on a super pylon. But the train time from gateway is reduced from 30 to 27 seconds. So, you can get in my experience, this is not a huge difference. Maybe you get a Stalker out, 3 seconds quicker to deal with a Reaper. Or in PvP, it has a bit of an effect. But it's mostly to make it slightly less likely for Protoss to outright die to proxy Marauder. Because they no longer have shield battery overcharge. We'll see. A Colossus, shields and HP moved around. This is one of the changes that seems to actually have been kind of a buff instead of just a change. Though it feels like a change I'd be okay with giving the Colossus, an actual buff. But getting some shields and HP moved around is something. The Tempest supply cost reduced from 5 to 4. And versus air attack range nerfed by 1, though. It's a buff. In most cases, a lot of the issue is having Tempest. For the same reason why putting the Ghost at 3 supply is a pretty major nerf. putting the Tempest at 4 supply instead of 5. Well, Void Rays are now getting almost entirely pushed out of having a role at all. But this allows you to get that kind of one-shot level of Tempest a little bit easier without cutting too much into your potential army supply of units that don't suck. So, because Tempests are required, but not exactly the unit you want. They have some of the least DPS in the game against anything that they aren't specifically supposed to counter. So, and that's what Protoss struggles from across the board, is over-specialization. Like, Immortals are incredible. If you watch Carbot, he demonstrates this very well. Immortal, Marauder, get out of my face. Ultras, implode. Thors, put them down. 4 Marines. Especially now. Yes. 4 Marines with combat shield, or 5 Marines without it, can beat an Immortal. And maybe even harder now, because while the Immortal costs 25 minerals less, it now attacks 10% slower. This is a nerf to Immortals to help Zerg. At least that's what we're claiming. You know which matchup it's going to affect more, I think? Protoss versus Terran. Since combined with this newest change, the Disruptor, now having a larger radius but doing less damage, Disruptors no longer one-shot Marauders. They do still one-shot Ghosts and Hydras and all those small units and have a larger radius, so you're more likely to hit. But now the Marauders will live and be healed, so you'll need something that does better anti-armor to deal with it. Unfortunately, your best anti-armor unit just got nerfed by 10%. And it's not like Immortals weren't great against her. They are. Immortal Archon, amazing against Lurkers. Carrier's also amazing. Having 2 Storms warped in with energy recharge, amazing. So, I think Zerg versus Protoss is in... It might get tilted towards the Protoss with this new patch, but it was in a relatively balanced, if somewhat lopsided state, where the Protoss would usually win any early 1 or 2 base. Zerg hits a 3 base timing up to through Hive and Lurkers, and they can crush it. And then the Sky Toss kicks in. So like a kind of a wave sort of thing. Terran versus Protoss even more pronounced, where the very early game is very Terran favored, as Protoss has really no way to kill Terrans outright, whereas even a single a Reaper or 2, or Hellions, or Cyclones, or pretty much every Terran unit that you can build in the first 5 minutes could potentially, Widowmines can potentially do game-ending damage. But then Blink kicks in, or maybe one of the other no, just Blink. Blink kicks in, and the Terrans have to respect it. Some of them might die. Max Packs may be able to just win the game off it. But then, as time goes on, not too much longer, Stim, Combat Shield, enough Metavacs to keep everything intact, and then Terrans become strong again. Right up until Protoss has enough splash damage. It's going to be a little harder to rely on that splash damage now. If you can get to Storm. Rushing Storm is not really an option. It's just far too expensive. It takes too long. That's just how it is. Every single game we've seen someone try to rush Storm with energy recharge against Terran, they have just died. Just immediate. But if not immediately, like within a minute or 2, because the Storms just don't do enough, and you can't have enough actual army to clean up the rest. And by the time you do clean it up, they're already building Ghosts back at home. So that is why Colossi and Robo is a staple. That's why most series on the PTR Max Packs didn't even build a Templar Archives. I don't even know. Some of those games against Scummy didn't even get Archons, even if the game goes past like 15 minutes. Which is kind of crazy, but also an indicator of how effective they are against a competent Terran. Now the Mothership is back to being more of a heroic unit. It can attack 4 targets at once, giving it pretty decent DPS. And can no longer be targeted by Abduct. Still has the same suite of abilities. Going to be quite a menace against Zerg. Against Terran, maybe slightly more useful than a waste of money. I wouldn't go too far past that. So overall, Protoss gets some changes. Almost nothing is a direct buff, because it's hard to pick out, like, unless we're willing to rework the core of Protoss. Not the mothership core, but instead... It's always so specialized at everything, it feels like. Every one of these patch notes we go through feels like, here you go, here, have a piece of candy, Protoss. No! Ah, yes. Immortals, a little cheaper. 10% slower attack speed. Like... And until... So the part of the reason is, or at least from my perspective, the reason you can't reliably buff charge lots or stalkers in a meaningful way is because you can warp in 20 of them at the front or in your opponent's main base or anything like that. And warp gate has always been this incredibly asymmetric tool that necessitates expensive Protoss units being relatively weak because they're still very strong when they're warped in by the dozen towards your opponent's base. So I think more than ever we're suffering from that, and Protoss in general suffering from that because gateway units just do not even get close to stacking up to a comparable cost from either Terran or Zerg of basic core units. Like, without the best... You might be like, well, Blink Stalkers can fight against Hydraling. I saw Max Packs do it. Hydraling A-moved with similar cost and supply against the best Blink Micro in the world, and the Protoss is going to come out kind of even. So, can you blame them for turtling to Carrier Templar? But I don't think any of these changes are necessarily bad, but they're barely scratching the surface of any problems here for Protoss, especially at the professional level. Well, let's take a look across the board. The Cyclone is reverted to the patch 5.0.11 clone. So, this is important because it shows they are willing. They are willing to actually change things up. That at some point, so this is reverted to the pretty much the pre-balance council version of the Cyclone. It has a tech lab. It requires a tech lab. Does a lot more damage. In fact, it's bugged to do extra damage now, because of course it is. And it's quite fragile, but also very fast. So it's an amazing sniper unit. It might be used en masse in unit compositions, but it's back to being kind of a singular unit in the early game. Salvage. Damage now cancels the salvage process. This is a slight nerf to bunkers and technically sensor towers, which can now be salvaged. Planetary Fortress armor reduced from 3 to 2. Slightly buffing Zerglings, Marines, and Zealots against it. I mean, everything against it except spells, but those are the units that have the least attack damage and the highest attack speed, so... In fact, this is mostly a buff to Zerg, as most Protoss units do enough damage to not care that much about armor. Even Zealots. Sensor Tower's cost dramatically reduced, but so is its radar range. And I think by a comparable amount, if you use some fancy trigonometry there. But can now be salvaged, which, alright. It's kind of a holdover for when we were adding to the campaign wish list of the first patch notes, which included salvaging missile turrets, which is an interesting way to discourage camping, in my opinion. I guess when you can salvage your tent, that discourages camping, or something like that. Anyways, Orbital Command now has... So the way this works is a supply depot has 400 HP. Say Ravagers are knocking on the door. They fire off a couple corrosive biles. The Zerglings, your depot's down to 100 HP. You drop this, and it takes a second, but if the depot survives for the animation to complete, that supply depot just went back to 500 HP, instantly healed to full. It's like a shield battery, but way better. And then, of course, you can still repair it normally, but this is also kind of a buff there. Now, the downside is the only time I think this will be meaningful will be in the early game. And since mules and scan are so amazing, Terrans might not have the energy for their third amazing ability on the orbital command. So ghost supply cost increased from 2 to 3. It's a nerf. It's a pretty big one as well in Terran versus Zerg. Though I keep coming back to, like, if you saw someone build 15 Vipers or High Templar, would you think that's a good idea or ridiculous? And why is it different for the Ghost? But of all the changes, this is the most simplistic one. It doesn't address the strength of an individual Ghost, but it addresses the strength of the rest of the army around it. And admittedly, for Terran, there's not much of an answer to certain army compositions without the Ghost. Archons would become incredible. High Templar may actually land a storm that does meaningful damage. Ultras would run the field. Broodlords would still kind of suck. There's plenty of counters to Broodlords, especially since we're not buffing them or bug fixing them at all. But I digress. So that's the issue here is, especially for anyone below Clem, using and keeping ghosts alive is already a struggle. In many scenarios, they're still going to get one-shot by disruptors. They're still going to get interrupted by lurkers. This is the only straight-up nerf to Terran. Well, I guess the armor thing here, but in the patch. Though it's quite a big one. I think more can be done, and if Terrans think that 3 supply, and I repeat that we're not in full alignment regarding the change, and pretty much got bullied into it by community members, sorry. I'd like to hear proposals. Like, the more drastic ones are like putting EMP on the Raven and making StarCraft 2 Brood War again, so that way you split having essentially the entirety of the late game for Terran being on one unit, which makes it like, from a spectator perspective, which is what I'm coming at most of this from, watching someone build one unit and counter entire armies feels very silly. Like, Winter, are you talking about Marines? No. Marauders? Also no. Battle Cruise? No. Ghosts is what we're talking about. Now, I think part of the issue with Ghosts, and part of why Protoss doesn't really have a great answer, is the feedback nerf from many moons ago. Feedback used to do 1 damage to enemy units. Ghosts have 100 HP, which means there was a real chance you could use a High Templar to invalidate or murder the Ghost outright. Just like the Ghost could do to the High Templar quite easily. You're like, well, feedback is instant cast, and EMP is not. Yes, but feedback is also single target. I would like, instead of buffing, I think the feedback change is something. I have some feedback. I know it only does half the damage it used to. But my feedback is, why don't we bring that back? Especially combined with energy recharge, it would give some more utility there. It would still make the Templar the Templar are probably one of the most fragile units in the game. Like, Infestors and Templar are the squishiest, voted most likely to die by everyone. Even Templar with their water balloons still somehow seem to die immediately. Whereas the Ghost is actually just, like, if you took away all the abilities, the Ghost is still a pretty solid fighting unit on its own. Its auto attack with bonus against light makes it very good against Zerglings and Zealots. It would not be worth the cost, especially with 3 supply. You wouldn't just build Ghost to auto attack. To be fair, you have Marines. But that combined with having all the... It's just too concentrated. I don't think Terran needs to be nerfed outright. I think the power needs to be spread a little bit. And that might mean Terran has to micro more spellcasters in the late game. Welcome to the club. Meanwhile, I got Protoss over here trying to throw out disruptor shots and not shoot their own zealots in the foot without killing marauders. You've got Zergs using Infestors and Vipers and Corruptors, which only counter air, so you don't want to stick around too long, and burrowing the Lurkers. And nobody A-moves their banlings at the professional level. That's not how it works. It's hard. The late game is hard across the board. But it looks, at least from a spectator perspective, very silly to watch someone build 25 ghosts and call that a real unit composition. It has for many years now. And even if it is balanced, it looks and feels dumb. And at the end of the day, look and feel is more important than statistical balance when it comes to a spectator sport, which StarCraft 2 is. With all that said, time to get to the Zerg. The Queen. Now, 175 minerals, the hatchery 275. The Spore Crawler does 20 damage but has less HP. So these changes are all tied together. With a nerf-ish to the Queen, the hatch, you can expand a little quicker, and the Spore Crawler damage. These are huge, tiny changes here. After 15 years almost to StarCraft 2, the Queen and the hatchery have now been changed in price. Not by much, but by enough to throw off every Zerg's build order so they can get a little taste of Protoss every patch when they have to relearn every build. I'll tell you, it's not enough different for players to change their place. You're still going to be building 10 Queens. Very simply, there's no other anti-air options. The Spore Crawler is no good against Terran because every early game Terran unit can easily avoid it. Now, Protoss is just going to energy recharge their oracles and make a lot more stasis wards. And because now you're kind of forced into spores and more expensive queens, and let's not pretend these balance out. You're allowed to build more than one queen per hatchery. On average, you have three hatcheries and maybe 7 or 8 queens. So by that point, you're already several drones short. So no longer will the Oracle and Adepts have to kill any workers. Those workers just won't exist in the first place because now you paid extra for the queens. So this is just, in my opinion, except in very niche scenarios, a straight-up nerf to the entire Zerg economy. Not a big one, but it's very hard to see this as a buff except in the specific scenario of people trying to block your hatchery, especially in Zerg versus Protoss. With 25 minerals left, it's a little more likely you're going to be able to slip that hatchery on. So, there you go. That is something. Actually, that's kind of a big deal in ZVP, to be honest. ZVT, this is just an early game nerf. ZVT, you need as many queens as possible. Spore Crawlers are mostly there for detection and deterrence, not actually damaging things. So, none of the just to be clear, none of the changes here have really changed Zerg versus Terran significantly up through, like, the Ghost Ultra phase. So, that matchup will remain similar, even if the details are slightly different. Hydralisk, muscular augments on creep. So once you get the speed upgrade, they will be slower than they were. Still faster than without the upgrade, but less of a creep speed bonus. And now nanomuscular swell. There's a whole debate over what we're going to call the Hydra Lurch upgrade. So we decided to make it the most confusing as possible by giving it a very technical name, but also calling the ability something else. So the ability is called Lunge. And that's really what it is. It just... literally, they do that kind of animation. Like the Frenzy from Campaign is the animation. And it requires a hive. This is just a nerf to Hydras. This ability is... It feels like a, well, here you go, but... I'd rather just have more movement speed on creep instead of my Hydras yeeting themselves all over the place. But... It's like... If it lasted longer than if it was like a 2 seconds or something, then maybe. But it literally gets you, I don't know, like 4 or 5 more range. Maybe you get out of the storm slightly quicker if you're able to hit the ability quickly enough. Combined with the Infestor Microbial Shroud. So this, it was my suggestion for Guardian Shield 2 years ago. Units that enter the Guardian Shield retain the Guardian Shield effect for several seconds when leaving the Guardian Shield. But instead, it's been applied to Microbial Shroud. Microbial Shroud, for those who do not know because it's rarely used, reduces the damage units take directly from air units by 50%. So a carrier interceptor, a liberator attack, it does not reduce the damage taken from spellcasting by any percents, which is why it is so rarely used. Because the amount of scenarios where you're fighting just air units with things on the ground, it only affects ground. So the scenarios where you're fighting explicitly air units, where there's no storm, or disruptors, or snipes, is so vanishingly small. And remember, the Infestor also has Fungal and Neural Parasite, two abilities which you probably want to be using more likely than Microbial Shroud. We've seen some occasional, like, defense against mass carrier rushes when they might not have all those spellcasters, but this, I don't think necessarily this should be given to the Sentry instead. I think it should be given to the Sentry also for Guardian Shield. So that way, units don't have to literally sit in the death bubble and try to protect themselves. And now the Ultra increases allied push priority from 0 to 1. Move speed bonus is reduced. And model size embiggened. So, the Ultra, I think this is a buff slightly to the Ultra as the net amount. Both in intimidation factor and the I've played with it some, I've watched it some. It does feel like the Ultras are much more reliable at closing in on the target. Though they won't get there as quick and not as many of them. But slight buff maybe to the Ultras, especially considering there'll be less ghosts and Immortals are slightly nerfed. Though the interactions I don't think will change dramatically. Ultras are still going to be a when you're ahead, get more ahead sort of unit. Very rarely a comeback unit, except in niche scenarios where your opponent doesn't have that late game tech. So, a buff, but a couple asterisks there. Alright, so bug fixes and quality of life. Some of these kind of bleed over into balance, but not really. Orbital Command Scanner Sweep now uses Team Color. I guess that's nice for casting. And team games. Command Center, Nexus, and Hatch auto rally to mineral fields. That's actually a noob buff. One of the few things that is directly targeted for noobs. Workers waiting for refineries, extractors, or simulators do not count as idle, which is nice. SCV random delay while building, adjusted, so that way they move around more consistently, though you can still micro it. Icon to command card for Infestor, Heli, and Hellbat showing unupgraded passive upgrades. So what's annoying to me is we did this. Like, you can see if the Infestor... There's no passive upgrades for the Infestor. Neural Parasite, but... Anyways, though. Not all units have passive icons on the command card. It's just randomly interspersed. So, I feel like all units should have the passive icons somewhere on the card. Or none of them. The fact that only some of them have it, and we seem to be kind of nickel and diming it, feels very weird. But I'd rather have it than not. Like, so you can see whether or not, like, advanced ballistics or chitinous plating is done. And be reminded it exists. Maybe adrenal glands for the Zerg if we're not going to give it an actual animation. But I digress. Siege tank and immortal tracking change. This is not a balance change. It's just kind of a fix. Blinding cloud fix. Planetary fix. Changeling, Zealot move speeds. This is mostly animation fixing and making sure units are more consistent. Except notably the Broodlord, which was admittedly bugged out here. That, alongside the buffs, which I don't think were required at all, were removed in the second iteration of the patch. Oh yeah, there's a note here that wasn't included on this list, but is in the game. The Lurker has been reduced from 200 to 190 HP. This is to make sure that disruptors can still two-shot it. Because even though they have 100 damage, if you don't fire two shots literally at the exact same moment, they would heal 1 HP in between because of passive Zerg regen. So we're nerfing Lurker HP for that exact scenario. I'm sure that won't have any effects on any other matchup either. Okay, so once again, we have a patch where it feels like Protoss takes 1 step forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and now we remove the stairs and we give them a slide. Yes, Protoss is a pain to play against on the ladder. Yes, Protoss makes up the majority of the people who lose weekly tournaments. And yes, Protoss is almost uncompetitive in Premier tournaments. These changes, I don't think will help Protoss be more consistent or stable against Terran in the early game. I do not think they move towards that goal. I think Protoss will be even more reliant on early blink timing, and pretty much just early blink timing, especially with the new old Cyclone being well positioned to shut down Stargate or even robo builds. Without blink, you're forced to play more defense, and without shield battery overcharge, it will be harder to play said defense. So blink will be the order of the day, probably every day. And I do want to say, I hope I'm wrong. I want to be wrong about many of these criticisms, but I'm putting them out there so that way you could say, Winter, you were wrong, all right? All that passionate commentary and those fancy words, no, you were wrong. Protoss now looks perfectly stable and doesn't die to random early game Terran units if your name is at max packs. The energy recharge ability buffs Protoss when it's already strong and doesn't help too much when it... I very much like the suggestion of what we were trying to do with the Thor. Just give more options instead of changing the options. Why not shield battery overcharge or energy recharge? And have it share a cooldown of some sort. I don't know, maybe give an indicator on the next eye of whether they have their super ability up. I don't know. But without shield battery, the reason, it was there for a reason. Much like Nexus and Pylon overcharge before it. A bit of a crutch, but it was holding Protoss up until they could get units that were actually competitive. So we'll see. The same thing for Zerg versus Protoss, where Zerg is going to be stronger at early timings, but weaker in the late. There's nothing in this patch that makes it easier to deal with Sky Toss. Don't you dare point to the microbial shroud change and say, look, you can now micro your Hydras with their lurch ability against Storm and Care. No, that's a joke. That's not going to happen. It's already almost impossible to beat that sort of composition on anywhere near even footing. You'll still see players maybe be able to overwhelm it if they're already way ahead from their crazy damage they were able to deal early. But it's going to feel it's going to feel like the old adage of how do you counter 12 carriers, with the oh-so-clever response being, don't let them get 12 carriers. But that process is going to be harder. Now, Terran versus Zerg, I think we'll end up in an okay spot here, actually. Everyone's favorite matchup. We're ignoring Protoss opinions, of course. Now, for us noobs, below the, bleeding edge, having more expensive queens, slightly worse Hydras, not gonna help not dying to those early timings, but with Ghosts being less of a spammable unit, and Planetary Fortresses being slightly less of an unbreakable position. And on the other side of things, Ultras being stronger but also less effective, as well as Lurkers having slightly less HP, Hydras being slightly less maneuverable. It feels like Terran versus Zerg is the only matchup that got a real kind of give and take here. So we will see how that plays out, but I think TVZ... So, to go over... I'm not even going to bother with mirror matchups. Alright, we're just ignoring those like many people do when they show up on their YouTube feed, so moving on. So, Protoss changes. are interesting, but lacking in direct... It feels like they get... It feels like Protoss gets pre-nerfed with each set of balance change. We never get the sort of... I've never seen a patch change to Protoss nearly in any of these balance council patches. I've never seen anything of the level. Let's nerf Liberators by giving them a 56% larger area increase. Like, imagine if we said we were nerfing Disruptors. You don't even have to get complicated here. We're nerfing Disruptors by giving them a 56% larger area increase, but reducing the damage by 20. You're like, well, how much are they increasing now? Are we not doing the math on that? It might be... No, that's not 56% larger, but instead we're reducing the damage past the threshold to one-shot key units and giving it a marginal increase instead. It does feel like the Protoss lose the Balance Council battle before they even fight it here. And there's a historically, think of the Protoss players who made the biggest splash in StarCraft 2. Parting, MC, SOS, Zest. And there are some exceptions like Stats and Neeb in the past, but most of the Protoss who've been wildly successful and iconic have played like insane people. Hero is also in that category. And that's because, for better or worse, Protoss benefits playing like a crazy person. I believe it's Parting who said that, but in a less family-friendly way. And that's simply because if you play normal or standard, you will lose against an equally or somewhat better skilled mechanically player. So these changes, I think, will continue that feeling, especially in Terran versus Protoss. We're still going to see Max Packs win plenty of games with Blink. And maybe occasionally an energy recharge. This is, no, another side note. If we want to do major changes to the game, like, say, an entirely new ability for Protoss. So we played on these maps, the old maps, for like 9 months. Okay, everyone's figured it out. Everybody knows Oceanborn, Alcyone, okay, even Dynasty and Crimson Court. So if we really want to adjust and we want to closely monitor any changes, why are we also changing the entire map pool at the same time? Now this, I don't think is the Balance Council's fault, because clearly right now, the issue is there's no one to do it. There's no one, like, I don't know what's going on at Blizzard. I'm not sure Blizzard knows what's going on at Blizzard. But ideally, every 3 months, we get at least, like, 3 to 6 new maps. Rotate it out. Keep some variety. Keep different builds going. But we have an opportunity to actually prove changes are going in the right direction. But instead, we've changed the entire map pool, which will, by the way, every time there's a new map pool, all-ins, early game, favored. Because the sword was developed before the shield, I assume. Otherwise, why did you need shields? But I digress. Protoss. But now that we're playing on new maps, what's going to happen is Protoss are going to come up with some crazy all-ins. They're going to win some games, maybe against better players. Zerg's the same way. And then, in 2 months from now, when everybody's played these maps 400 times, it's going to be all figured out. It's going to be a lot harder to pull over that, like, blink timing or proxy gate, or that roach all-in, or that proxy, or that bunker rush. But right now, it's going to get like a new map pool with no balance changes. We'll see a shift. And I think the balance through maps is much more relevant than balancing through slight stat adjustments like Colossus HP. Another thing is, a lot of people ask, how do you make a Protoss favored map? It's pretty obvious how to make a Terran favored map. Just put rocks everywhere, ledges, give them multiple Reaper locations, and limit, like, Overlord pillars. Zerg, the more open the better most of the time. It depends a bit, but Protoss, somewhere in between. So there's a new feature that we saw in the TLMC, the map contest, recently called Healing Shrines, where you can move your units to the Healing Shrine, usually in like a center or like outlying location, not in your base, and heal your units. Because what is Protoss suffering from the most? They can't heal at all. You have that Colossus with a 150, 200 HP, 250 HP, half HP, never getting it back. All right? You know, that's what I want to test. Is instead of buffing the strength outright of Protoss units, maybe make it so they can get back into the fight at more than 50% strength. And now this is something that would benefit pro players much more than your average noob on the ladder, because pro players have the APM and the multitasking to potentially make use of these sort of things. Now, I'd love to see that. I think balancing through maps is a much more reliable and interesting way to do things than changing, like, the role or completely shifting, like, completely gutting the early game again for Protoss. So, we will see. I know I've ranted for a while, but I already expect, like, this, we've already heard the changes listed out. You've made it this far. You're an hour in, right? Yeah. So, thank you for making it this far, by the way. But I hope it made some sense. My summary of the patch is a lot of interesting ideas, but I can't help but read the clear... We've heard major concerns. The Ghost Nerf, we've heard major concerns. How about changing the entire Protoss early game? I really feel, and we've seen some posts about it, Protoss players are too fucking reasonable. Okay? Half the time, I see people post about Terran versus Protoss. This is what I see. It's like, well, you don't really understand. Like, having 3 ghosts with 3 more supply is going to... Like, that is an entire drop less of timing, and there's already very thin timings when you're dealing with blink all-ins early on, and you don't really have... Especially if your add-ons are on the wrong side of the map, and we should be able to move our add-ons around. Then, having a siege tank early, and now a siege tank limits you can't even get a cyclone at the same time, and that cuts in, you have to get 2 gases, and Protoss are like, I'd love to make a Stargate and not die to a Winnow Mine. Yeah, but have you considered that Protoss is, like, you have so many other options as well. Protoss with their shields and the Chrono Boost is, like, you can just rush into any sort of tech. Meanwhile, we're over here trying to build... Let's stick up for ourselves, Protoss. I don't even necessarily want Protoss to have, like... I don't want Protoss to be overpowered. I want them to have cool stuff. And right now, all the, like, it seems like the Mothership is the only unit that is allowed to get buffed to a meaningful extent. And that's because you can only have 1. I'm down with buffing the Cyclone if you could only have 1. Or the Battlecruiser if you could only have 1. That inherently limited. It's the only unit in the goddamn game that is limited by the amount. And therefore, it's alright to buff because you won't have to deal with multiple. It is the only... Yes, yes. So, it leaves kind of a poor taste. One, because the original patch was clearly completely incoherent in what it was trying to accomplish, no matter what the stated goals. And now, it feels like we've just kind of pared it down, but the same principles apply, which are you can't buff Protoss without also nerfing Protoss. We'll only nerf Terran if there's such overwhelming backlash that literally cannot be... When the world champion says ghosts are maybe a little good, then maybe, begrudgingly, kicking and possibly also screaming, I wouldn't put it past him. Well, okay, we'll try the most milquetoast, simple, and untargeted nerf to the ghost. Alright, we'll try it. But also, Zerg players get to relearn the early game, too, because everything costs different. So, I don't hate it. Despite, like, I'm being very critical, because I've been kind of, it's pretty okay in the past, and that hasn't gotten anything done. And they've already said, based on community feedback, which, strong and vocal, made a difference. So, I want to say, I don't think this patch is bad, but I definitely think it could have been better. And I hope that we get more back and forth. I hope we don't get things like, well, we had ideas, but we didn't change them, despite having almost a month to update again. Like, the original patch notes were on October 21st. The second version was October 31st. It's very scary. Well, the third version could have been on November 10th or whatever, but it really did feel like the second version was just going to be that. Well, that's that, and that's what we ended up with. So, my disappointment is measurable, not immeasurable. My day is not ruined, but it's not that much better either. So we'll see. We'll closely monitor, and I truly hope we get an update in less than 6 months. You know, I'd also like an update. Side note, we're in a weird spot for StarCraft 2. We don't have any knowledge of tournaments coming up next year. Pretty much. It's heavily implied there will be something like the Esports World Cup. But, and here's the thing about the Esports World Cup. Sponsored by the Saudis, who have the inverse of their ethics and income, doesn't really matter how many people are watching. They don't seem to care. So, to be a full devil's advocate in so many ways, it might not matter what the Balance Council does. I do hope it can get better. And I hope that feedback is meaningful. Like, people want to watch cool things with variety, but they also want it to feel like players have a chance at most parts of the game. It shouldn't feel like once Clem has survived the Blinkstalkers, he will always win. Most of the time, yes, but not all the time. And I think, I don't know if I mentioned it or I was just thinking it, but if there was to be someone to make executive decisions and be an executive scapegoat, I'd volunteer Pig, who does the legwork and has the experience and is more than willing to see and test criticism to a dramatic extent. So, we will see. And of course, after seeing the feelings on David Kim in the past, nobody really wants to be that person. But I hope we consider a bit more... I don't know what the logistics are at Blizzard and what the problems are there. I'm going in circles now, I know. So, final summary. Protoss changes are a bit questionable. I don't think we've solved TVP stability. I think it's going to be worse. And I hope I'm wrong. Terran versus Zerg looks pretty okay. Zergs are still going to struggle before the later game, but maybe be even a bit better off now that they're not dealing with quite as many ghosts. So it might tilt a little bit back towards the Zerg. Protoss versus Zerg is going to be an absolute nightmare for everyone who isn't Cyril, I imagine. And even Cyril, I think, is going to struggle. We're going to see a lot more early timings, trying to make use of the lack of shield battery overcharge, because waiting until they get Templar, Storm, and Carriers is going to be frustrating, to use the Balance Council's words. So, with all that said, I will conclude this extended edition of the finalized patch notes for the new StarCraft 2 Balance Patch 5.0.14. I hope it didn't feel like it was just all ranting. I hope you feel educated on the changes. And make no mistake, this is still the best game in the world, with the most entertaining gameplay, with the most passionate community. And I think the fact we're arguing this in 2024, despite the severe neglect that Blizzard has shown the game, is a testament to that. So, do not let this discourage you. I'd encourage you to play some games yourself, or at least, you know, log back in and find something you like. And otherwise, it'd be awesome if you check out the second channel, Winter Gaming TV, where I have my gameplay, which is part of where I'm drawing some of this from, and more relevantly, obviously, the casting and all that. Well, stay tuned and keep an open mind. But also don't be afraid to speak yours. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I made your day a little bit better. I'll see you next time. Good luck, have fun, stay chill.